From the very start, Sophie had been different. Where others longed for stability, she craved something more: passion, danger, the kind of love that burned too hot to last. Her mother had warned her about such desires, about men who would take more than they gave. But Sophie never listened. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to drown in something dark and consuming. Charles had been the opposite of everything she fantasized about: steady, responsible, a man who provided without question. A trucker, gone for weeks at a time, trusting in the marriage they had built. But stability had never been enough for Sophie. She wanted to feel something real, something reckless. By the time she turned 35, the line between fantasy and reality had long since blurred. It started online, harmless at first, flirting with strangers, testing boundaries. Then came the meetings. Older men, powerful men, men who knew how to take what they wanted. It wasn't just about romance anymore. It was about control, about surrendering to something bigger than herself. Charles, always gone, never suspected a thing. He believed in their love. He believed in her. Then she met them. A group of older black men, experienced, commanding, indulgent in ways that made her crave more. They introduced her to a world she had only dreamed about, a world where she wasn't just wanted, she was owned. She slipped further into obsession, sneaking out at night, meeting them in dimly lit motels and exclusive clubs. The thrill became her lifeline. Harold McKinley had lived across the street for over 20 years. A retired postal worker with too much time on his hands and an eye for things that didn't belong. He had noticed the changes, the late nights, the strange cars parked outside while Charles was away. At first, he told himself it wasn't his business. But the more he saw, the more uneasy he became. One night, he saw something that pushed him to act. It was after midnight. Sophie stood at the end of the driveway, arms wrapped around herself. Two men approached, tall and confident, their voices low and commanding. She hesitated for only a second before getting into their sleek black car. Harold hesitated, then picked up the phone. Charles was halfway through a long-haul route when his phone rang. He almost ignored it, but Harold never called unless it was serious. "Charlie, I don't want to alarm you, but I just saw Sophie leave with two black men. She didn't look right. I think you need to come home." A deep chill settled in Charles's gut. Who were they? "I don't know, but she looked scared." That was all it took. Charles pulled off at the next exit, turned the truck around, and started the long drive home, his pulse pounding. When he arrived, the house was empty. Sophie was gone. He searched every room, hoping, praying Harold had been mistaken. But deep down he knew. The signs had been there all along. He had just refused to see them. Then, in their bedroom, he found it. A crumpled piece of paper beneath her pillow. An address. Charles recognized the street immediately, an industrial part of town, notorious for its underground clubs and illicit dealings. The kind of place where people vanished. With his heart pounding, Charles grabbed his keys and drove. The club stood at the end of a narrow street, its neon sign flickering weakly. Music pounded from within, vibrating the pavement. The parking lot was full of expensive cars, dark-tinted windows hiding whatever happened inside. Charles stepped out, fists clenched. He didn't belong here. He didn't care. He shoved open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and something foul beneath it. Dim red and gold lighting cast long, eerie shadows. Women in tight dresses moved through the crowd, their laughter hollow. Charles didn't waste time. He pushed through the bodies, holding up a picture of Sophie to the nearest man he could find. "I'm looking for my wife." His voice was rough with urgency. The man barely glanced at the picture before smirking. "You're in the wrong place, old man." Charles grabbed the man's collar, yanking him close. "Where is she?" The smirk faded. "Check the back." Charles let go and stormed forward. He shoved aside a heavy curtain and stepped inside. And then he saw her. Sophie. His wife. Half naked. Surrounded. 10 men. Their eyes gleaming with amusement, their postures relaxed. Something inside Charles shattered. The world blurred. The pounding in his skull drowned out the music, the laughter, the murmured conversations. Then everything went red. His hands found an iron rod leaning against the wall. It became a weapon. The first swing landed hard. A sickening crunch. A scream. Chaos erupted. The men lunged at him, but Charles didn't stop. His mind had dissolved into pure, unfiltered rage. He swung again. Another man collapsed. Some ran. Others fought. But Charles didn't care. By the time it was over, 3 men lay motionless on the ground. And Sophie? She was staring at him. Not with gratitude. Not with relief. But with something else. Something darker. Something he didn't want to understand. The drive back home was silent. Charles kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The air in the truck was thick with tension, with the weight of what had just happened. Sophie sat beside him, wrapped in his old jacket, her face turned toward the window. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the club. The blood on Charles's hands had dried, cracking against his skin as he flexed his fingers. He could still hear the sickening crunch of bones breaking, the guttural screams of men who had underestimated just how far he would go. He had never been a violent man, but something inside him had snapped. And now, there was no going back. The headlights carved through the darkness as they pulled into the driveway. The house stood just as they had left it, quiet, still, an illusion of normalcy that had long since shattered. Charles killed the engine, but neither of them moved. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on them, suffocating. Finally, Sophie shifted. "You didn't have to do that." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. Charles turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Didn't have to?" She met his gaze, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't place. "You think you saved me?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I got you out of there, didn't I?" Sophie let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You have no idea what you've done." Charles felt a slow, creeping chill settle in his chest. He had expected relief, maybe even regret. But the look in her eyes wasn't that of a woman who had been rescued. It was something darker. Something that made him wonder if he had ever really known her at all. He climbed out of the truck and walked around to her side, opening the door. "Get inside." Sophie hesitated but eventually slid out. She moved with careful steps, as if the night had stolen some part of her. Charles followed her up the steps and into the house, locking the door behind them. The moment they were inside, Sophie turned to face him. "What now?" Charles exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "You're going to tell me the truth." She arched a brow. "The truth? You think you want that?" He took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I need to know." Sophie studied him for a long moment before sighing. "It wasn't just them, Charles. It wasn't just some reckless mistake. I wanted it. I sought them out." His stomach turned. "Why?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Then, finally, "Because they made me feel alive." Charles clenched his fists, his pulse hammering. "And I didn't?" Sophie looked away. "Not like that." A silence stretched between them, heavy and unbreakable. Charles had imagined this moment differently. He had thought she would cry, apologize, beg for forgiveness. But there was no remorse in her eyes, no regret in her voice. Just a cold acceptance of the choices she had made. And that scared him more than anything. "I killed for you tonight, Sophie," he said quietly. "I destroyed men for you." She stepped closer, reaching out to touch his face. "And you liked it, didn't you?" His breath hitched. She smiled, just barely. "You felt it too. That rush. That power." Charles recoiled, stepping back as if burned. "What the hell are you saying?" Sophie tilted her head. "I think you understand exactly what I'm saying." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Charles stared at the woman he had married, the woman he had fought for, and realized he had no idea who she truly was. Or worse, who he was becoming. Charles stood in the dimly lit motel room, the air thick with the scent of sweat and stale smoke. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her body wrapped in a silk robe that barely clung to her shoulders. She didn't look at him. Not fully. Instead, her gaze hovered somewhere near his chest, her fingers gripping the sheets beneath her. "What did you do?" she finally asked, her voice eerily calm. Charles didn't answer. He couldn't. His knuckles were still raw, his breathing still uneven from what had happened back at the club. The blood on his shirt, some of it his, most of it not, felt heavier than the weight in his chest. "We need to go," he said instead, his voice rough. Sophie didn't move. "And then what? You think we can just drive away from this?" Charles clenched his fists. "We don't have a choice. You think those men are just going to let this go? We need to disappear. Now." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you?" She finally met his eyes, and what he saw there made his stomach twist. "You don't get to decide when this ends." Charles took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Then tell me what to do. Because I sure as hell am not leaving you to deal with this alone." Sophie studied him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "We need money. We need a car that can't be traced back to us. And we need to get out of this city before sunrise." Charles nodded. "I can take care of that." She stood then, finally, pulling the robe tighter around her body. "Then let's go." As they stepped out of the motel, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't running from trouble. They were running straight into it. Charles drove through the deserted streets, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face unreadable. The tension between them was thick, neither daring to break the silence. "Where are we going?" Sophie finally asked, her voice quiet. "West." "Away from all of this," Charles replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sophie scoffed. "And then what?" "Keep running forever. If that's what it takes." Charles exhaled sharply. "I'm not letting them get to you." Sophie turned to face him, her expression hard. "You don't even know who they are. You think those men were just random? This goes deeper than you think, Charles. You can't just swing a damn iron rod and expect it to be over." He glanced at her, anger flickering in his eyes. "Then tell me what I don't know." She hesitated, fingers tightening in her lap. "I was never supposed to leave. They own me, Charles. And now, by extension, they own you too." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Charles swallowed hard, his pulse pounding. "Then we find a way to make sure they don't." Sophie shook her head. "You don't get it. There is no way out." Charles pressed harder on the gas pedal, determination settling in his bones. "There's always a way out. We just have to find it before they find us." As the city lights faded in the rearview mirror, Sophie's fingers brushed against his on the gearshift. For the first time in a long time, fear flickered in her eyes. They weren't just running anymore. They were being hunted. The headlights cut through the thick fog as Charles drove west, his grip on the steering wheel tightening with each passing mile. The weight of the night's events pressed heavy on his chest, but he couldn't let it slow him down. Not now. Sophie sat beside him, quiet, her fingers clutching the crumpled paper with Victor's address. "How do you know this guy?" Charles asked, finally breaking the silence. Sophie hesitated, shifting in her seat. "I met him years ago. Before you." That didn't sit right with Charles, but now wasn't the time to push. "And he helps people disappear?" "He helps people who have something to offer." Charles glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "And what exactly do we have to offer?" Sophie didn't answer. The silence between them stretched as the highway unfolded before them. The road signs told Charles they were nearing the outskirts of the city, the part where streetlights were few and civilization thinned out. He exhaled, glancing at the dashboard clock. Nearly 4 a.m. They had been driving for hours, neither of them sleeping, neither daring to stop. Finally, Sophie spoke. "There's a gas station up ahead. We should stop. We need fuel, and," she trailed off, rubbing her arms. I need to clean up. Charles nodded. He pulled into the small, deserted station, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above them. The place looked run down, like it hadn't been renovated in decades. He stepped out and started pumping gas while Sophie disappeared into the restroom. A few minutes later, as the numbers on the pump clicked higher, Charles scanned the area. No cars. No people. Just the vast emptiness of the early morning. Then he felt it. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. Subtly, he shifted his stance, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the gas station. The shadows near the convenience store stretched unnaturally long. Someone was watching. His fingers twitched toward the tire iron in the back seat, but he forced himself to stay calm. Whoever it was, they hadn't made a move yet. Sophie stepped out of the restroom, her face freshly washed, her expression instantly tightening when she saw his posture. "What is it?" she whispered. Charles didn't answer, just jerked his chin toward the shadows. She followed his gaze, her face paling. "We need to leave. Now," she muttered, sliding into the passenger seat. Charles didn't argue. He finished pumping, got in, and peeled out of the gas station, watching the rearview mirror the whole time. The shadow didn't move. But he knew better than to think they were safe. By the time they reached Victor's address, the sky had begun to lighten. The house was tucked deep into the woods, the long driveway barely visible from the main road. It was an old, abandoned-looking estate, surrounded by tall trees that whispered in the early morning wind. Charles killed the engine and turned to Sophie. "If this is a setup—" "It's not," she cut in quickly, though something in her voice wavered. "Just let me do the talking." Charles clenched his jaw but nodded. They stepped out, their footsteps crunching against gravel as they approached the heavy wooden door. Sophie knocked 3 times, sharp and deliberate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a crime novel. Tall, lean, dressed in a dark suit that somehow looked both expensive and effortlessly disheveled. His piercing eyes locked onto Sophie first, then slid to Charles with barely concealed amusement. "Sophie," he drawled. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again." "Victor," she said, forcing a smile. "We need your help." Victor tilted his head, his gaze flicking between them. "Help costs, darling. And last I checked, you weren't in a position to pay." Charles stepped forward. "We just need to disappear." Victor smirked. "Disappear? That's a tall order." He stepped back, motioning them inside. "But lucky for you, I do love a challenge." As they stepped into the dimly lit house, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they had just walked into something far worse than what they were running from. The tension in Victor's house was suffocating. Dim lighting cast long shadows across the wooden floors, and the scent of aged bourbon lingered in the air. Charles remained near the entrance, his back to the door, his instincts screaming to keep an escape route open. Sophie, on the other hand, had already stepped further inside, facing Victor with an unreadable expression. Victor leaned against the grand fireplace, swirling a glass of dark liquor in his hand. "So tell me, Sophie, why should I help you?" he asked, his voice silky but laced with something dangerous. "Because I don't have a choice," Sophie admitted, her tone steady. "We need new identities, safe passage out of here, and a clean slate. You're the only one who can make that happen." Victor chuckled, his eyes flashing with amusement. "I do love how you assume I'm still in that line of work. Things change, sweetheart. People change." Charles scoffed. "Cut the bullshit. You still have connections. Otherwise, we wouldn't be standing here." Victor turned his attention to Charles, his smirk widening. "And you must be the husband. I have to say, you're a lot more intense than the last guy." Sophie flinched but said nothing. Charles clenched his jaw. "Are you helping us or not?" Victor sighed dramatically, setting his glass down. "I can get you what you need. But there's a price." "How much?" Sophie asked, already dreading the answer. Victor's smirk disappeared. It's not money I need. It's a favor. One that requires specific skills. Charles narrowed his eyes. What kind of favor? Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. There's a man in town. A problem. Someone who needs to be dealt with. You do this for me, and I'll make sure you both vanish without a trace. Sophie stiffened. You're asking us to kill someone. Victor shrugged. Call it what you want. But if you want a new life, this is the cost. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears. Charles exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Give us a name. Victor smiled. Now that's the spirit. As he slid a folded piece of paper across the table, Sophie reached for Charles's hand, squeezing it tightly. They had left one nightmare behind, only to step into another. And there was no turning back now. The scent of old wood and aged whiskey filled the dimly lit room as Charles stepped inside behind Sophie. Victor led them through a narrow hallway lined with bookshelves, the kind filled with dusty leather-bound tomes that hadn't been touched in years. The place smelled of secrecy, and Charles didn't like it one bit. Take a seat, Victor said, motioning to the worn leather couch in the center of the room. He poured himself a drink from a decanter on the nearby bar cart, then glanced at Sophie. You want one? She shook her head. Charles didn't respond, his jaw tight. He wasn't here for pleasantries. Victor took a slow sip, studying them with a mix of curiosity and amusement. So, let's hear it. You want to disappear. That tells me one thing. You've pissed off someone powerful. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. We don't have time for games. You help people vanish, don't you? That's all we need. Victor smirked. I help people who interest me. And right now, you've got my attention. He turned to Sophie. Last time I saw you, you were running toward trouble. Now you're running from it. What changed? Sophie tensed. I made the wrong enemies. Victor chuckled. Story of my life. He downed the rest of his drink and set the glass aside. Tell me, who's after you? Cops? Gangsters? Someone you double-crossed? Sophie hesitated. Charles noticed the slight tremor in her hands before she balled them into fists. It's bigger than that. Victor's smirk faded. He leaned against the bar, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood. That's so. They won't stop, Charles said, his voice low. They'll hunt us down until we're dead. Victor nodded slowly, considering. Then he stood, walking toward the heavy drapes covering the windows. He pulled them open just a fraction, peering outside. The early morning light barely touched the forest surrounding the house, leaving everything cloaked in shadows. I can make you disappear, Victor finally said, turning back to them. New identities, a way out of the country. But it's not free. Charles exhaled sharply. How much? Victor grinned, shaking his head. Not money. Sophie stiffened. Then what? Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. I need something handled. A loose end of mine that's becoming a problem. He looked at Charles. You've already proven you're capable of handling things. Charles's stomach twisted. He knew what Victor was asking before the words were even spoken. A hit? Charles asked. Victor nodded. Call it what you want. But if you do this for me, I'll get you both out of here clean. Sophie swallowed hard, looking at Charles. He could see the plea in her eyes. They had no other choice. Charles turned back to Victor. Who's the target? Victor's smirk returned as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He tossed it onto the table in front of them. Charles picked it up and felt his blood turn ice-cold. It was Harold McKinley, the neighbor who had called him, the only man who had tried to help them. Do this, Victor said, his voice smooth as silk, and you both get to live. Silence filled the room. Charles looked at Sophie, then back at Victor. His fingers curled around the photo. He had killed before. But this? Killing the only man who had ever given a damn? He wasn't sure if he could live with that. But he was sure of one thing. If he didn't, they were as good as dead. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Charles's feet. He followed closely behind Victor as they walked through the dimly lit corridor, Sophie trailing just a step behind. Every inch of this place exuded secrecy. Dusty bookshelves filled with old leather-bound volumes, curtains heavy with time, and a faint scent of aged whiskey lingering in the air. "Are you sure about this?" Charles whispered, his voice barely audible. Victor smirked without looking back. "You don't have much of a choice, do you?" They finally reached a large oak door at the end of the hall. Victor pushed it open effortlessly and motioned for them to enter. Inside, a long wooden table dominated the room, illuminated by a single, dim overhead light. Papers were scattered across its surface, maps, documents, photographs, each one a fragment of something bigger, something sinister. Sophie inhaled sharply as she recognized one of the faces in a photograph. It was a man she had hoped never to see again. Charles caught the look in her eyes and stepped forward, snatching the photo off the table. "Who is he?" he asked, though he could already tell from the tension in Sophie's shoulders that this wasn't just some stranger. "His name is Anton," Victor said, pouring himself a drink from a nearby decanter. "And he's the reason you two are in this mess." Sophie turned to Victor, her expression unreadable. "How do you know that?" Victor chuckled, swirling the dark liquid in his glass. "Because Anton came to me first. He wanted to know if I could track you down. Wanted me to bring you in." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Charles clenched his fists, stepping between Victor and Sophie. "And what did you tell him?" Victor shrugged, taking a slow sip before answering. "I told him I'd think about it. But I don't sell out my old friends so easily." "Lucky for you." Sophie let out a shaky breath. "If Anton's looking for us, then he won't stop." "He never does." Victor leaned back against the table, setting his glass down. "Which means you two need to disappear for good. I can help you with that, but it won't be cheap. And it won't be easy." Charles exchanged a glance with Sophie before turning back to Victor. "What do we need to do?" Victor smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "First, you need to get out of this house. Anton's men are already on their way." A loud crash sounded from the front of the house, followed by heavy footsteps. "Time to move," Victor said, reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. "Unless you want to meet Anton sooner than planned." Charles grabbed Sophie's hand, adrenaline surging through his veins as they followed Victor toward the back exit. The game had just changed, and they were running out of moves. The night air was thick with tension as Charles, Sophie, and Victor slipped through the back door into the dense forest beyond. The distant sound of breaking glass and shouted orders told them Anton's men were already inside, searching, hunting. Victor moved swiftly, leading them through a winding path he seemed to know by heart. "We have a safe house a few miles from here," he murmured. "But we need to move fast. They'll figure out where we went soon enough." Charles tightened his grip on Sophie's hand, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel her trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that they'd get through this, but he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They pressed on through the undergrowth, twigs snapping beneath their feet. The darkness was both their ally and their enemy, hiding them from view but making every step treacherous. A sharp whistle split the silence. Victor froze, raising a hand to halt them. Charles listened closely, heart pounding. Then, another whistle, this time closer. "They know we're out here," Victor hissed. "Keep moving." A gunshot cracked through the night. Sophie let out a gasp as bark splintered from a nearby tree. They broke into a sprint, crashing through the brush, adrenaline fueling their desperate escape. Ahead, the forest thinned, revealing the outline of a cabin barely visible in the moonlight. "There!" Victor shouted. "Inside now." Charles shoved the door open, ushering Sophie inside before turning back for Victor, only to find him standing frozen, gun raised. From the shadows, a man stepped forward, his face illuminated by the cabin's dim light. "Anton. Going somewhere?" Anton drawled, his voice smooth, deadly. He gestured with his pistol. Inside all of you. It's time we had a little chat. Charles's stomach clenched as he exchanged a glance with Sophie. There was no running now. The trap had been sprung. The cabin was silent except for the heavy breathing of its occupants. Anton stood in the doorway, his gun trained on Charles, Sophie, and Victor. His men flanked him, their weapons ready, their expressions unreadable. "You really thought you could run from me?" Anton said, his voice almost amused. "You, of all people, should know better, Charles." Charles clenched his fists, his mind racing. There was no way out. Not this time. Victor took a slow step forward. "Anton," he said carefully, "we don't have to do this. You got what you wanted. Sophie's out. Let them go." Anton chuckled. "Let them go. That's funny, Victor. But you see, this isn't just about Sophie anymore. It's about respect. You don't cross me and walk away." Charles moved protectively in front of Sophie. "Then take me and let her go." Sophie's eyes widened. "Charles, no." Anton tilted his head, considering. "Tempting. But no. See, I need an example. Something people will remember. If I let her go, what message does that send?" The tension was unbearable. Victor shifted, his hand subtly reaching for his gun, but one of Anton's men caught the movement and struck him hard across the face, sending him to the ground. "Enough talking," Anton snapped. "I'm tired of this game." Then, without warning, the lights flickered. A split second later, the room plunged into darkness. Gunfire erupted. Sophie screamed. Charles lunged forward, tackling Anton to the ground. The two men struggled in the darkness, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. A body hit the floor with a sickening thud. Sophie scrambled backward, her breath ragged. "Charles." A moment of silence. Then, as the emergency lights kicked in, Charles pushed himself up, blood dripping from his forehead. Anton lay beneath him, unmoving, a knife buried deep in his chest. Victor groaned, rolling onto his side, blood trailing from his temple. Anton's men were either dead or had fled. The fight was over. Sophie collapsed into Charles's arms, sobbing. He held her tightly, his own body trembling. "It's done," he whispered. "It's over." Victor grunted, staggering to his feet. "We need to go before the cops show up." Charles nodded. He took Sophie's hand, leading her toward the door. They stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting them like a lifeline. No more running. No more fear. They were free. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.